The Middle Ages left us cathedrals, kingdoms, and questions that refuse to die. Behind every castle wall and yellowed parchment lies a mystery that historians still argue about today. Some were buried by time. Others, perhaps, were buried on purpose. Tonight, we're uncovering 10 medieval enigmas that continue to defy explanation. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Beneath the rolling hills of Bavaria and Upper Austria, hidden beneath farmhouses, churches, and forest floors, lie narrow passages carved into the earth by hands that left no names behind. They are called Erdstall tunnels, from the German words for earth and stable, and there are more than 700 of them scattered across this quiet stretch of Central Europe. Most are barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through. Many twist downward before opening into small chambers, then narrow again into passages so tight that only a child or someone desperate could pass. Who built them, and why? The facts we do have are frustratingly thin. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological context place most Erdstalls in the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries AD, though some researchers argue certain tunnels may be older still. No tools have been found inside them. No bones, no artifacts, no written records from the people who dug them. Whoever carved these passages did so carefully, deliberately, and then left almost nothing behind to explain themselves. Mainstream historians have proposed practical theories. Perhaps they were refuges, dug by villagers fleeing raiders or soldiers during a turbulent era of shifting borders and roving armies. Perhaps they were storage chambers, used to keep grain or valuables cool and hidden from thieves. Perhaps they served a purely economic purpose, quarrying clay or stone for construction above ground. Each explanation is plausible. Each fits, at least partially, with what little physical evidence remains, and yet certain details resist easy answers. Why dig passages so narrow that grown men would struggle to pass through them if the goal was shelter for entire families? Why place chambers deep enough to require crawling on hands and knees when a simple cellar would have sufficed for storage? Why do so many Erdstalls appear near churches or ancient settlements, as if built with intention rather than convenience? This is where the speculative theories begin, carefully and without claiming certainty. Some folklorists point to centuries-old local legends describing the tunnels as dwellings of the Shrazel, small earth spirits said to inhabit the underground in alpine folk tradition. Whether these stories predate the tunnels or grew up around them later is impossible to say. Others have suggested the passages held ritual or spiritual significance, perhaps used in rites of passage or symbolic death and rebirth ceremonies, the physical act of crawling through darkness into a hidden chamber and emerging again. There is no direct evidence for this, but the psychological weight of the act itself, vanishing into the earth alone in total darkness, is difficult to dismiss as accidental. What we're left with is a landscape riddled with silence. Hundreds of tunnels, painstakingly excavated by medieval hands, for a purpose their builders felt no need, or were forbidden, to record. In an age when nearly everything of value was written down, taxed, or blessed by the church, the Erdstalls stand out precisely because they weren't. They exist outside the historical record, known only through the ground itself. Perhaps one day, a tunnel yet undiscovered will hold the fragment of evidence that finally explains them. A tool, an inscription, a clue overlooked by centuries of digging farmers and curious archaeologists. Or perhaps the Erdstalls were always meant to keep their secret, sealed in darkness beneath the soil of Bavaria, waiting for a question we haven't yet learned how to ask. If the Erdstalls remind us that some mysteries are carved into the earth and left wordless, Our next mystery reminds us that even the most meticulously documented institutions in medieval history can lose something enormous and never get it back. Rising from the flat, marshy plains of northern Poland, along the banks of the Nogat River, stands a fortress so vast it remains to this day the largest brick castle on Earth. Malbork Castle, once known by its German name, Marienburg, was the beating heart of an empire built not by kings, but by monks who had traded prayer books for swords. This was the seat of the Teutonic Order, and somewhere within its walls, its lake beds, or its long-vanished vaults, an immense fortune is said to have disappeared without a trace. To understand the mystery, we first have to understand the order itself. Founded in the late 12th century during the Crusades, the Teutonic Knights began as a modest hospital brotherhood caring for wounded and sick pilgrims. Within decades, they transformed into one of the most formidable military and economic powers in medieval Europe. Invited into the Baltic region in the 13th century to Christianize and subdue the pagan Prussian tribes, the order carved out a sovereign monastic state unlike anything else in Christendom. Part crusading army, part feudal government, part international trading empire. They controlled the lucrative amber trade along the Baltic coast. They levied taxes, minted coins, and built an extraordinary network of brick fortresses, granaries, and administrative centers. By the 14th century, the order's wealth rivaled that of many European kingdoms, and Marienburg Castle stood as its glittering, fortified capital, a symbol of monastic discipline fused with staggering material power. This is where the historical record is clear and well documented. Chronicles, account books, and archaeological surveys confirm the order's immense income from trade, tribute, and land holdings. Historians know the order maintained treasuries within its castles, storing gold and silver coin, ecclesiastical treasures, ceremonial armor, and gifts from allied nobility across Europe. What historians do not know, what no single surviving document fully explains, is where a significant portion of that wealth ultimately went. The turning point came in 1410, on a field near the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg. There, the combined forces of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Teutonic Order, killing the Grand Master himself and shattering the myth of the Order's invincibility. Though Marienburg withstood the immediate siege that followed, the battle marked the beginning of a long, grinding decline. Over the following decades, the Order's finances collapsed under the weight of war reparations, mercenary wages, and internal rebellion. By 1457, the Order could no longer pay the very soldiers it had hired to defend its own capital. In a moment almost too symbolic to be true, Marienburg Castle, the impenetrable heart of a once mighty empire, was handed over not through conquest, but through debt, sold to the King of Poland by unpaid mercenaries acting on their own authority. And this is precisely where the mystery begins. Contemporary records suggest that in the final chaotic years before the castle changed hands, the Order's remaining treasury, coin, plate, relics, and valuables accumulated over 2 centuries of conquest and trade, was significantly diminished from what earlier accounts describe. Some of this can be explained plainly enough. War is expensive. Mercenaries demanded payment in hard currency. Diplomatic bribes, ransoms, and battlefield losses would have steadily drained even a fortune as large as the Order's. Mainstream historians largely accept that much of the treasury was simply spent, piece by piece, in the desperate effort to keep the Order's crumbling state alive. But not everyone finds that explanation fully satisfying. Why? Because the sums described in earlier Order documents and the sums accounted for in the transactions of the 1450s don't entirely align. Local chronicles and later folklore both preserve a persistent thread. That before the final surrender, a portion of the treasury, some say plate and coin, others insist relics of considerable religious and material value, was deliberately hidden by loyal knights and officials who refused to let it fall into Polish hands. Where such a hoard might have gone is where the historical trail runs cold, and speculation begins to take its place. The most enduring local legend points toward the region's abundant lakes. Northern Poland, particularly the area around Malbork, and the wider region once known as Prussia, is dotted with deep glacial lakes, dark, cold, and in the medieval period, largely unmapped beneath their surfaces. Local tradition in several nearby villages tells of knights loading wagons under cover of darkness and driving them onto the ice of a frozen lake, deliberately breaking through to sink their cargo before the enemy could arrive. Is this the folk memory of an actual event, reshaped and exaggerated over 5 centuries of retelling? Or is it simply the kind of treasure legend that attaches itself naturally to any collapsed empire, the way vines grow over an abandoned wall? Without documentary confirmation, we cannot say for certain, and that uncertainty is exactly what has kept the story alive. Other theories point not outward to the lakes, but inward to the castle itself. Marienburg is a structure of staggering scale and complexity, built and rebuilt over nearly 2 centuries, layered with additions, fortified basements, and passages that shifted in purpose as the order's needs changed. Restoration work carried out in the 19th and 20th centuries, and further reconstruction after the extensive damage the castle suffered during the Second World War, uncovered sealed chambers and blocked passageways that had not been accessible for generations. Most, upon investigation, proved architecturally mundane: storage rooms, defensive features, structural adjustments made across centuries of renovation. But each discovery has, understandably, reignited the old question. If unknown spaces could still be found within a castle this thoroughly studied, this extensively mapped by historians and preservationists, what else might remain sealed within walls that are, in places, several meters thick? There are more fringe theories still, ones that drift further from the documentary record and deeper into speculation. Some treasure hunters, drawing loose comparisons to the Knights Templar, the more famous crusading order whose own wealth vanished into legend after their suppression in the early 14th century, have suggested the Teutonic Knights may have adopted similar practices of concealment, distributing portions of their wealth across secret caches in multiple locations rather than a single hidden hoard. Others point to the order's continued diminished existence after the loss of Prussia. The order technically survives in a much smaller ceremonial form even today, and ask whether institutional knowledge of a hidden treasury might have been quietly preserved and passed down, known only to a select few within the organization's later, much reduced leadership. These theories carry little direct evidence, but they persist for a simple reason. The numbers in the old account books don't add up, and unresolved numbers have a way of inviting explanation, however speculative. What makes the vanished gold of the Teutonic Order different from many treasure legends is the sheer weight of documentation surrounding it. This isn't an obscure whisper from a single unreliable source. The Order kept meticulous records. Historians have studied its finances extensively, and still, gaps remain, small enough to be explained by the ordinary chaos of war and debt, yet large enough to leave room for doubt. Archaeological and archival research continues at Malbork to this day, conducted by Polish historians and preservationists who treat the castle less as a treasure map and more as an extraordinarily complex historical document written in brick and mortar. Their findings have added enormously to our understanding of the Order's daily life, its military organization, its craftsmanship. But the specific question of the missing treasury remains, more than 5 centuries later, unresolved. Perhaps the explanation is as simple as it seems. A dying state spent its last resources trying to survive, and the discrepancies we see today are simply the imperfect record-keeping of a collapsing bureaucracy. Wars are chaotic. Account books get lost. Estimates get exaggerated in the retelling, both by the order's own scribes hoping to appear solvent, and by later chroniclers eager to add drama to a story that hardly needed it. That is, after all, the most probable answer, and probability is not the same as proof. But somewhere beneath the dark water of a Prussian lake, or within a sealed void behind a wall that has not been opened since the 15th century, there may yet be an answer waiting. Or perhaps there is nothing there at all, only silence, and the enduring human need to believe that something so vast could not simply disappear into ledgers and war debts, that somewhere it must still be waiting to be found. We left the story of Marienburg's missing treasury unresolved. Its answer perhaps sunk beneath a frozen lake, perhaps buried in the arithmetic of a collapsing empire. But there is another layer to this castle's mystery, one that has nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the building itself. Because Malbork Castle, for all that historians have written about it, for all that architects have measured and mapped and restored, has never fully given up its floor plan. Even now, walking through its high brick corridors, past its vaulted refectories and its soaring Gothic chapel, visitors are moving through a structure that continues, occasionally, to surprise the very experts who have devoted their careers to understanding it. To grasp why, you have to understand what Malbork actually is. This is not a single castle, but 3 interconnected fortresses, built in phases across nearly 200 years, beginning in 1274 and expanding steadily as the Teutonic Order's power grew. There is the High Castle, the innermost and oldest section, housing the monastic quarters, the chapter house, and the Order's most sacred spaces. There is the Middle Castle, added later, built to house the Grand Master's palace, guest quarters, and the administrative machinery of an increasingly complex state. And there is the Low Castle, the outer working ring of stables, workshops, and storage buildings that kept the whole fortress functioning. Each section was built, modified, and reinforced by different Grand Masters over different decades, often layering new construction directly over or alongside older structures rather than demolishing them. The result is a castle that is less a single coherent design than a kind of architectural palimpsest. Walls built upon walls, foundations upon foundations, each generation of builders leaving traces that the next generation sometimes covered over entirely. This layered construction is well documented and, on its own, not mysterious. Medieval castles across Europe grew this way, expanding to meet the needs of the moment rather than following a single master plan. What makes Malbork different is scale. This is, by masonry volume, the largest brick castle ever constructed, roughly 21 hectares of fortified ground, with walls in places reaching several meters thick. A structure this immense, built across 2 centuries by an organization that valued secrecy in both its military and religious functions, was almost guaranteed to contain spaces that would eventually be forgotten. And history gave those spaces every opportunity to be forgotten. Malbork did not pass peacefully from one caretaker to the next. After the order sold the castle in 1457, it became a royal residence for Polish kings, who modified its interior to suit Renaissance and later Baroque tastes, walling off medieval spaces that no longer served a purpose and were, by then, considered outdated or inconvenient. In the 18th century, following the partitions of Poland, the castle passed into Prussian hands and was, for a time, used as military barracks and even a granary, a humiliating decline for what had once been the seat of a monastic empire, but one that involved further structural alterations, new walls, new floors, new purposes carved into old stone. Napoleon's forces occupied and looted the region in the early 19th century, and while detailed records of what, specifically, was removed from Malbork during this period are incomplete, the castle's role as a working fortress and military resource during Napoleonic campaigns is well established. It was only in the 19th century, during a wave of Romantic-era interest in medieval history, that serious restoration work began, an effort to reconstruct Malbork not as it had become, but as it once was. This is significant because it means our modern understanding of the castle's original medieval layout is itself, in part, a reconstruction, an informed, scholarly, archaeologically grounded reconstruction, but a reconstruction nonetheless. And reconstructions, however carefully done, occasionally reveal that the previous few centuries of alteration hid more than anyone initially realized. The most dramatic confirmation of this came not from careful 19th century scholarship, but from catastrophe. During the Second World War, Malbork suffered extensive damage. By some estimates, more than half of the castle was destroyed or severely damaged during the fighting of 1945, as Soviet forces advanced through the region. It was, by any measure, a tragedy for medieval heritage. But the destruction also did something no careful survey had managed to do in the preceding century. It opened the castle up. Collapsed walls exposed cavities that had been sealed for generations. Fallen floors revealed foundations beneath foundations. The decades-long reconstruction effort that followed, one of the most extensive medieval restoration projects in European history, required Polish archaeologists, architects, and historians to essentially re-excavate the castle from the inside out, cataloging each surviving fragment before rebuilding around it. It was during this painstaking post-war work that several previously unknown or long-forgotten spaces came to light. Some were architecturally explicable once examined: disused storage vaults, structural reinforcements added during some now undocumented renovation, drainage or ventilation shafts serving purposes that later generations no longer needed and simply sealed over. This is the straightforward, well-supported explanation for most of what restorers found. Not concealment for its own sake, but the ordinary accumulation of centuries, each generation building over what the last one no longer used. But a few discoveries have resisted easy categorization. Chief among them is the so-called Gdańsko Tower, a massive, isolated structure connected to the main castle by a long, covered gallery raised high above the ground on a series of brick arches. Officially, and quite plausibly, historians identify the Gdańsko as a combined latrine and last resort defensive refuge, a design found in several other Teutonic Order castles, where the tower's sewage function was deliberately paired with its role as a final fallback position during a siege, since attackers would be reluctant to fight their way through what was, quite literally, the castle's toilet. It is a practical, well-evidenced explanation, and yet the tower's basement level, along with sections of the connecting gallery, contains chambers whose full original function remains debated among specialists. Were they purely functional additions to the sanitation and defensive system? Or did some portion of this isolated, easily secured structure serve a more private purpose, a place to store something valuable, precisely because it was physically separated from the main castle and required crossing an easily defended, easily watched bridge to reach? Beneath the high castle itself, the castle's well, a functioning water source essential to surviving any siege, has long attracted its own quiet speculation. Wells in medieval fortresses served an obvious practical function, but they were also, on occasion, used across medieval Europe as places of concealment, their depths making them difficult to search, and their water making recovery of anything sunk within them genuinely difficult. No systematic, publicly documented modern excavation of the full depth of Malbork's well appears to have settled the question of what, if anything, might rest at its base beyond centuries of sediment and debris. This is not evidence of anything hidden. The absence of a thorough excavation simply means the absence of an answer in either direction. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern non-invasive survey techniques, increasingly used at heritage sites like Malbork since the late 20th century, have added a further layer of intrigue. These surveys are primarily conducted for entirely practical, unglamorous reasons, assessing structural stability, planning conservation work, understanding foundation conditions before further restoration. But such surveys have, on more than one occasion at large medieval sites across Europe, identified anomalies, variations in density or unexpected voids beneath floors and behind walls that don't immediately correspond to any known architectural feature. At Malbork specifically, conservation authorities have been measured in their public statements about such findings, generally attributing anomalies to the castle's well-documented history of collapsed and rebuilt sections, rather than to anything more provocative. This caution is itself instructive. The people who know this castle most intimately, the archaeologists and conservators who have spent entire careers within its walls, tend to be the least inclined toward dramatic speculation, and the most inclined to note simply that not every anomaly has yet been fully investigated, and not every investigation yields a tidy answer. This is where the more speculative theories take hold, offered here not as established fact, but as the kind of persistent local and popular narrative that tends to grow around any building this old, this large, and this deliberately secretive in its original construction. Some treasure hunters and amateur historians have proposed that sealed chambers within the Middle Castle's Grand Master's palace may once have connected to escape passages leading beyond the castle walls entirely, a common feature, at least in legend, of medieval fortresses belonging to institutions with enemies on multiple fronts. Others have speculated that portions of the Order's archive, its most sensitive internal correspondence and financial records, might have been deliberately concealed rather than destroyed during the chaotic final years of the Order's rule, hidden by officials who hoped some future restoration of the Order's fortunes might make that documentation valuable again. There is no confirmed physical evidence for either claim, but the castle's genuine, well-documented history of surprise discoveries, real chambers found during real restoration work, whose original purpose took specialists years to determine, lends these theories a certain grounded plausibility that pure invention would lack. What can be said with confidence is this: Malbork Castle has been studied, surveyed, and restored more thoroughly than almost any other medieval structure in Central Europe, and it has still, within living memory, revealed spaces that no one alive knew existed. That fact alone should give us pause before assuming that a building this vast, this old, and this thoroughly rebuilt across 7 centuries of shifting ownership has finally given up everything it contains. Restoration work continues at Malbork to this day. Slow, careful, archaeologically rigorous work, driven not by treasure hunting but by genuine historical preservation. Perhaps that ongoing work will eventually account for every void, every anomaly, every sealed space within these walls. Or perhaps somewhere behind a wall rebuilt after the war, or beneath a floor laid down by a Renaissance-era king who cared little for what lay underneath it. Something still waits. Not necessarily gold, not necessarily anything as dramatic as legend suggests, but simply an unrecorded space, a fragment of the castle's 700-year memory that has not yet found its way back into the light. If Malbork teaches us that even the most exhaustively studied buildings can conceal what they no longer wish to reveal, our next mystery takes us somewhere far less monumental, far more elusive, into the folded valleys and mist-covered hills of mid-Wales, where no castle stands, no tower waits to be excavated, and the only clues are the mountains themselves. Somewhere within this rugged, sparsely populated landscape, a king's treasury vanished so completely that 6 centuries of searching have failed to recover so much as a single confirmed coin. This is the story of Owain Glyndŵr, the last native Welshman to hold the title Prince of Wales, and the royal treasury that disappeared alongside him into the hills he knew better than any enemy ever would. To understand what was lost, we first have to understand what briefly existed. In September of 1400, Owain Glyndŵr, a Welsh nobleman of considerable lineage, educated in London, trained in law, a man who had served in English military campaigns before turning against the crown that had employed him, raised his banner in revolt against King Henry IV of England. What began as a regional uprising, sparked by a land dispute with a neighboring English lord, rapidly transformed into the largest and most successful Welsh rebellion in recorded history. Within a few short years, Glyndŵr's forces had captured a string of major castles, including the formidable fortresses at Harlech and Aberystwyth. By 1404, he controlled most of Wales, and did something no Welsh leader had done in generations. He convened an independent Welsh parliament, first at Machynlleth and later at Harlech, and was formally crowned Prince of Wales in a ceremony attended by envoys from Scotland, France, and Castile. This is the part of the story that is not legend but documented history, confirmed by English royal records, French diplomatic correspondence, and the physical remains of the castles and administrative sites Glyndŵr controlled. For a brief window of roughly a decade, Wales functioned as something close to an independent state, with its own parliament, its own diplomatic relationships, and, critically for our story, its own royal treasury, established to fund the war effort, pay allied troops, and support the machinery of an emerging Welsh government. Surviving French records document formal treaties and alliances with the court of Charles II, including military support sent to aid Glyndŵr's forces. A Welsh state, however briefly, was raising taxes, receiving foreign subsidies, and managing state finances on a scale unprecedented in Welsh history. And then, almost as swiftly as it had risen, it collapsed. English forces under the future Henry V gradually reclaimed the castles Glyndŵr had captured. French support, never fully reliable, withdrew as France became consumed by its own internal conflicts. By 1409, Harlech Castle, by then serving as Glyndŵr's primary stronghold, and reportedly housing his family and a significant portion of his remaining resources, fell to a prolonged English siege. Members of Glyndŵr's family were captured. His movement, though it would continue in fragmented guerrilla form for several more years, had lost its capital, its administrative center, and, as far as historical records can determine, access to whatever remained of its treasury. Here is where the documented history ends and the mystery genuinely begins. Owain Glyndŵr himself was never captured. Despite substantial rewards offered for his capture, despite years of English military campaigns specifically aimed at hunting him down, he simply disappeared into the Welsh countryside sometime after 1412 and was never seen in any confirmed historical record again. His ultimate fate, where he died, when, and where he was buried, remains genuinely unknown to this day. Itself one of the enduring mysteries of medieval British history, but intertwined with the mystery of the man is the mystery of what he may have taken with him. Because the treasury that had funded a decade of rebellion, that had paid foreign mercenaries and Welsh soldiers alike, that had supported an independent parliament and a royal court, that treasury does not appear, in any surviving English record, to have been fully recovered when Harlech fell, nor at any point during the years of manhunts that followed. What, precisely, did this treasury contain? Historical records are frustratingly general on this point, though the fragments we do have are suggestive. French subsidies would likely have arrived in the form of coin, given the standard practices of medieval diplomatic and military financing. Taxes collected from Glyndŵr's Welsh territories would have added to this, alongside whatever plate, jewelry, and ceremonial regalia would have accompanied the establishment of an independent princely court, the trappings of state that any self-declared prince of the period would have required to legitimize his rule in the eyes of both his own people and foreign allies. Some historians have also pointed to the symbolic importance of a crown or coronet reportedly used in Glyndŵr's investiture ceremony, an object that, if it existed as described, has never been recovered or definitively identified in any museum or private collection. The mainstream historical explanation for the Treasury's disappearance is, in many ways, the least dramatic one, and likely the most accurate. War is expensive, and a losing war is catastrophically so. By the time Harlech fell in 1409, Glyndŵr's rebellion had been fighting on multiple fronts for nearly a decade, without the consistent foreign support it needed to sustain itself. It is entirely plausible, even probable, that much of the treasury had simply been spent by that point, on mercenary wages, on military supplies, on the ordinary and extraordinary costs of maintaining a rebel state under siege. What little remained may have been distributed among Glyndŵr's remaining loyal commanders as the rebellion fragmented into smaller guerrilla units after Harlech's fall, used to fund continued resistance rather than concentrated in any single hidden cache. But, as with so many of the mysteries we've explored, this practical explanation coexists uneasily with the details that don't entirely settle the question. Welsh oral tradition, preserved across centuries in local folklore throughout Snowdonia and the surrounding hill country, insists persistently on a different narrative: that as English forces closed in on Harlech, Glyndŵr's loyal followers removed a portion of the royal treasury before the castle's fall, carrying it into the mountains to keep it from English hands, intending to preserve it for a restoration of Welsh independence that never came. Unlike some treasure legends that emerge centuries after the fact, elements of this tradition appear in Welsh sources reasonably close to the events themselves, lending it, in the view of some Welsh historians, slightly more credibility than a purely later invention would carry, though slightly more credible folklore remains a considerable distance from documented fact. The geography of the region adds its own layer to the speculation, in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. Snowdonia is a landscape of genuine practical concealment. Steep-sided valleys, dense ancient woodland in the medieval period, countless caves and rock formations across a terrain that Glyndŵr and his closest followers, many of them local to the region, would have known intimately, far better than any English pursuer. This was, after all, a war Glyndŵr won for years, partly through his mastery of guerrilla tactics suited precisely to this unforgiving terrain. If a Welsh leader wished to hide something from English search parties who did not know these mountains as he did, mid-Wales in the early 15th century would have offered no shortage of suitable, defensible hiding places. This is not evidence that a treasury was hidden, but it is evidence that hiding one in this specific landscape would have been entirely feasible for a man with Glyndŵr's particular knowledge and resources. Over the centuries, this combination of genuine historical gaps and genuinely suitable terrain has produced a persistent thread of treasure hunting throughout the region, some of it serious antiquarian inquiry, much of it considerably less rigorous. Numerous caves across Snowdonia and the surrounding hills carry local names and associations linking them to Glyndŵr, including several known locally as Owain's Cave or similar variants, though no archaeological excavation has yet produced confirmed treasury artifacts at any of these sites. Some researchers have focused attention on the area immediately surrounding Harlech itself, theorizing that in the chaos of the siege's final days, valuables may have been hidden nearby rather than transported any significant distance, perhaps in coastal caves or hidden inland passages within reach of the castle before it fell. Others have looked further afield, toward Glyndŵr's ancestral lands around Sycarth and Glyndŵrdwy, reasoning that a man planning for the possibility of defeat might have arranged for resources to be secured on his own family's traditional territory, rather than in unfamiliar ground. More speculative theories venture further still, into territory even sympathetic historians treat with considerable caution. Some have suggested that a portion of the Treasury may have left Wales entirely, transported to sympathetic contacts in France or Scotland as Glyndŵr's foreign alliances began to fray, potentially explaining why no trace of it has ever surfaced within Wales itself, despite centuries of searching. Others point to the enduring mystery of Glyndŵr's own final years and unknown grave, suggesting that wherever he ultimately died, some traditions favor Herefordshire, where he may have lived quietly among descendants of his daughter's family. Any resources he retained until the end may simply have been dispersed among a small circle of loyal supporters and never recorded, deliberately kept from history in service of protecting Glyndŵr himself during his final years as a hunted man. What makes this mystery distinct from many treasure legends is its inseparability from the broader, unresolved question of Glyndŵr's fate. He was, after all, a leader skilled enough to evade capture entirely for years, across a kingdom actively hunting him with the full resources of the English crown. A man capable of disappearing that completely was, by definition, capable of concealment on a scale that has left both his grave and his treasury unresolved for over 600 years. Perhaps the two mysteries share a single, simple answer, wherever it may lie. Perhaps they don't. Modern metal detecting surveys and archaeological interest in the region continue, conducted under Wales's careful heritage protection laws, and occasional finds of medieval coin hoards across Wales periodically reignite public speculation, though none have yet been conclusively linked to Glyndŵr's court. The mountains of Snowdonia keep their own counsel, as they have for 6 centuries, indifferent to the treasure hunters who have searched their slopes and the historians who have searched their archives alike. Perhaps the treasury of the last Prince of Wales was spent long ago, absorbed into the ordinary machinery of a losing war, leaving nothing behind but a story shaped by loss and longing for what might have been. Or perhaps, somewhere within those folded valleys, in a cave whose name has been passed down without its meaning, something is still waiting for the mountain to finally give it up. The story of Glyndŵr's vanished treasury belongs to a rebellion that very nearly succeeded. Our next mystery reaches back further still, to a conflict that failed completely, and to a moment, on a cold December day in a quiet valley, that ended not just a man's life, but the independent existence of Wales itself. Near the small village of Sealmary, in the heart of the Welsh countryside, a stone monument now marks the spot where, in 1282, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last sovereign prince of Wales, was killed in a skirmish so minor that for centuries, historians could not even agree on precisely how it happened. And in the chaos surrounding his death, something else disappeared as well. The treasury, regalia, and symbols of an independent Welsh principality that had taken generations to build. To understand what was lost that December, we need to understand what Llywelyn had built, and how precarious it truly was. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd inherited a fractured Wales, divided among competing princely lines, and through decades of shrewd diplomacy and calculated warfare, achieved something none of his predecessors had managed: genuine, internationally recognized sovereignty. In 1267, the Treaty of Montgomery formally recognized him as Prince of Wales by Henry III of England, the first and only time an English crown granted such recognition to a native Welsh ruler in writing. Under this treaty, other Welsh lords owed him fealty rather than the English king directly, a structure of genuine, if fragile, national unity. For roughly 15 years, Wales existed as something it had rarely been before, and would not be again for over a century. A single political entity, with its own prince, its own court, and its own administrative and financial apparatus. This is documented, uncontested history, confirmed by English and Welsh chronicles alike, by surviving treaty texts, and by the administrative records that any functioning medieval principality would have generated. Records of taxation, of court expenditure, of the tribute and payments owed by subordinate Welsh lords to their prince. Llywelyn's court, based primarily around his stronghold at Dolvidalen and later other fortifications in Gwynedd, would have required and accumulated the material trappings any medieval sovereign needed: coin for governance and diplomacy, plate and jewelry befitting a recognized prince, and quite possibly formal regalia used to symbolize his unique status, a status no other Welsh ruler before him had achieved through legal recognition rather than conquest alone. The peace that Montgomery established did not last. Relations between Llywelyn and the English crown deteriorated steadily through the 1270s, worsened considerably by the accession of Edward in 1272, a king with far less patience for Welsh autonomy than his father had shown. By 1276, war had resumed, and Edward's first campaign in 1277 forced Llywelyn into a humiliating settlement that stripped away much of the territory and authority Montgomery had granted him. It was the Second War, beginning in 1282 and sparked by a rebellion led by Llywelyn's own brother Dafydd, that would prove fatal, not just to Llywelyn's rule, but to any prospect of continued Welsh independence for centuries to come. The circumstances of Llywelyn's death remain, even in the mainstream historical record, genuinely uncertain in their details, which is itself worth pausing on. Contemporary English and Welsh chronicles offer different, sometimes contradictory accounts of what happened near Silmeri on the 11th of December 1282. What seems most likely, based on the balance of surviving evidence, is that Llywelyn had moved south with a portion of his forces, possibly to rally additional support or open a new front in the war, and became separated from the bulk of his army. He was killed in a relatively minor encounter with English forces, reportedly not even recognized as the Prince of Wales until after his death, when his body was identified. His head was subsequently sent to London, displayed publicly as a symbol of Edward's total victory, a detail confirmed across multiple chronicle sources, and one of the darker, better documented facts of this entire episode. What happened to everything else? Llywelyn's personal effects, his court's remaining treasury, and, critically, the regalia associated with the Princedom of Wales, is where the documented record becomes considerably thinner. We know, with reasonable confidence, that Edward's forces captured significant symbols of Welsh sovereignty in the aftermath of the 1282–83 conquest. English records confirm that a relic known as the Crow's Naid, believed to be a fragment of the true cross and one of the most sacred objects associated with the Welsh princely line, was seized and taken to Westminster, where it remained a royal possession for centuries afterward. This particular object's fate is, unusually for this story, well documented. But the Crow's Naid was a religious relic, not the full material wealth of a principality. What became of the working treasury, the coin, the plate, the accumulated resources of Llywelyn's court, during the specific chaos of his death and the subsequent months of continued Welsh resistance under Dafydd, is considerably less clear. This gap matters because the war did not end with Llywelyn's death. His brother Dafydd continued fighting for several more months, maintaining at least a fragmented court and command structure into the following year, before his own capture and brutal execution in 1283 finally extinguished organized Welsh resistance. Any resources that had survived Llywelyn's death would have passed, at least nominally, into this continued resistance. And the same pattern we've seen elsewhere in this exploration repeats itself here. a losing cause, fighting on borrowed time, with a treasury that was likely being spent down even as its custodians tried desperately to preserve Welsh independence by any means available. The mainstream historical position, consistent with what we know of how medieval treasuries typically dissolved during military collapse, holds that most of Llywelyn's material wealth was almost certainly absorbed into the ordinary costs of continued warfare during 1282 and 1283, paying what remained of Welsh forces, funding Dyfed's continued resistance, and eventually whatever remained falling into English hands as Edward's forces systematically subdued Gwynedd over the following months. Edward's conquest was thorough and well documented. English administrators moved quickly to establish control over Welsh finances and territory, and it would be somewhat surprising, from a purely practical standpoint, if a substantial hidden treasury had survived that process entirely undetected. And yet, as with the mysteries we've already explored, certain details resist total resolution. Welsh chronicles and later folk tradition, particularly concentrated in the region around Llywelyn's northern strongholds in Gwynedd, preserve persistent stories that loyal followers, recognizing the war was lost even before Llywelyn's death, moved to secure at least a portion of the princely treasury and regalia beyond English reach, not necessarily out of hope for immediate recovery, but out of a desire to deny Edward the complete, symbolic totality of his victory. Unlike some later treasure legends, these traditions are notable for emerging from a region, Gwynedd, that remained the last redoubt of Welsh resistance throughout the entire conquest, giving the stories at least a plausible geographic and temporal connection to genuine wartime desperation, even if their specific details cannot be verified. The physical landscape of Gwynedd lends itself naturally to this kind of speculation, much as Snowdonia did in Glyndŵr's later story. Though it's worth noting these are the same mountains, the same valleys, separated by over a century of Welsh resistance rooted in identical terrain. Dolwyddelan, Llywelyn's primary stronghold, sits in a landscape of steep, forbidding hills and narrow valleys that would have made rapid, thorough English searching genuinely difficult in the immediate aftermath of conquest, particularly while organized resistance continued elsewhere in the region. If resources were moved for safekeeping during the final desperate months of 1282 and 1283, this terrain would have offered no shortage of opportunity for concealment by men who knew it intimately. Beyond the general folk tradition of hidden treasure, more specific and more speculative theories have attached themselves to particular locations over the centuries. Some antiquarians and local historians have focused attention on the area immediately surrounding Silmeri itself, theorizing that whatever Llywelyn carried with him on his final, fatal expedition south may have been hidden nearby by surviving members of his party before English forces could search the area, though the small scale of Llywelyn's southern force makes it unlikely this would represent the bulk of any treasury, if such theories hold any merit at all. Others look toward Llywelyn's traditional territorial heartland in Gwynedd, and specifically toward the network of religious houses that maintained close relationships with the Welsh princely line, suggesting that monasteries sympathetic to Llywelyn's cause may have taken custody of valuables for safekeeping, a plausible mechanism, given the genuine historical role medieval monasteries played as safe repositories for secular wealth during periods of war, though no specific monastic record has yet surfaced to confirm this occurred here. A further complication, and one that separates this mystery somewhat from others we've explored, is the question of what, precisely, we would even be looking for. Unlike a clearly defined royal treasury with documented account books, the material wealth of Llywelyn's principality existed for barely 15 years under formal international recognition, built rapidly and under near constant military pressure. Its full extent was likely never as fully documented, even in its own time, as the finances of more established medieval states. This means that even a complete and successful search of the Gwynedd countryside might well fail to find anything. Not because nothing was ever hidden, but because there may never have been a single, concentrated treasury to find in the first place. Only the scattered, modest resources of a 15-year experiment in independence that was already fraying under the weight of war before Llywelyn ever rode south to Silmeri. What we're left with, 740 years later, is a landscape that has given up remarkably little. Occasional archaeological work around Llywelyn's known strongholds continues to refine our understanding of daily life within his court, but no confirmed treasury, hoard, or cache of princely regalia has ever definitively surfaced. The stone monument at Silmeri stands today as a memorial to a man and a moment, marking not just where a prince died, but where an independent Wales, in any formal sovereign sense, effectively died alongside him. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the true loss of 1282 was never a treasury at all, but something less tangible and more thoroughly lost, a nation's brief, hard-won sovereignty, scattered as completely and as irrecoverably as whatever coin and regalia may or may not still rest somewhere in the folded hills of Gwynedd, waiting, or perhaps not waiting for anything at all. Where Cilmeri offers a single stone marking a single death, our next mystery takes us somewhere far less marked, far less visited, into the sun-scorched plains of Castile, to a fortress monastery that once commanded one of the most powerful military religious orders in medieval Spain, and to an archive so vast, so meticulously maintained across 5 centuries, that its partial disappearance remains one of the more perplexing institutional mysteries in the history of the Reconquista. This is the story of the Order of Calatrava and the lost records that, even now, historians are still trying to fully account for. The fortress of Calatrava la Nueva rises from a rocky outcrop in the province of Ciudad Real, its weathered walls overlooking the surrounding countryside with the same watchful severity it held nearly 800 years ago. This was not merely a castle, it was the administrative and spiritual heart of an entire military order, one of several such orders that emerged across the Iberian Peninsula during the long, grinding centuries of the Reconquista, as Christian kingdoms pushed steadily southward against the Muslim taifas and caliphates that had ruled much of Spain since the 8th century. The Order of Calatrava, founded in 1158, was among the earliest and most influential of these institutions, predating even the more famous Spanish orders of Santiago and Alcantara, and its knights combined, much like the Teutonic order we explored earlier, the disciplines of monastic life with the brutal practicalities of frontier warfare. The founding story itself is well documented and worth understanding, because it illustrates just how central record-keeping and institutional memory were to the order from its very earliest days. In 1158, the Knights Templar, who had previously held the frontier fortress of Calatrava, found themselves unable to continue defending it against the threat of Almohad forces advancing from the south. Rather than abandon the position, the fortress was entrusted to Raymond of Fitero, a Cistercian abbot, who organized a defense that, according to the traditional account, succeeded largely through the sheer number of men who rallied to the cause under the promise of spiritual reward. From this defense emerged a new military order, formally structured along Cistercian monastic lines, but dedicated to continuous warfare against Muslim territories to the south. Over the following century and a half, the Order of Calatrava grew into a formidable institution, accumulating vast landholdings across Castile and beyond, commanding significant military forces, and playing a decisive role in major engagements of the Reconquista, including the pivotal Christian victory at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, a battle whose outcome fundamentally altered the balance of power on the peninsula, and is confirmed in extensive detail by both Christian and Muslim chroniclers of the period. An institution of this scale and longevity, one that endured for over 3 centuries as an independent military order before its eventual incorporation into the Spanish crown in 1487, necessarily generated an enormous body of administrative documentation. Land grants, papal bulls confirming the order's privileges, internal chapter records documenting decisions made by its leadership, financial accounts tracking the substantial revenue generated by its extensive agricultural and commercial holdings, military records of campaigns and garrison assignments, and correspondence with the Castilian crown, with the papacy, and with allied and rival institutions across Iberia. Historians know this archive existed in substantial form because portions of it survive today, preserved primarily in Spain's National Historical Archive in Madrid, where researchers have spent generations cataloging and studying what remains. These surviving documents have allowed for remarkably detailed reconstructions of the order's administrative structure, its economic activities, and its military campaigns across multiple centuries. But here is where the documented history gives way to genuine, persistent uncertainty. The surviving Calatrava archive, extensive as it is, contains significant gaps, periods, particular categories of record, and specific documented events referenced in surviving correspondence for which the underlying original documentation has simply never been located. Some of these gaps are unremarkable and easily explained by the ordinary hazards that faced any medieval archive: fire, water damage, the simple deterioration of parchment and paper across centuries of storage in conditions that, by modern archival standards, were often far from ideal. Medieval and early modern Spain was not free of the kinds of catastrophic events that regularly destroyed documentary records elsewhere in Europe. Wars, sieges, the periodic relocation of archives from one fortress or administrative center to another, each move carrying its own risk of loss, damage, or simple misplacement. Yet several specific and substantial gaps in the Calatrava archive have proven more difficult to explain through ordinary attrition alone, and it is these gaps that form the heart of our mystery. The most significant concerns the Order's internal chapter records, the minutes and decisions of its governing councils, for substantial stretches of the 13th and 14th centuries, precisely the period when the Order was at the height of its military and political influence, engaged in complex negotiations with the Castilian crown, with rival military orders, and with the papacy over matters of jurisdiction, taxation, and military obligation. Surviving correspondence from this period, preserved because it was sent to or received from external parties who maintained their own separate archives, frequently references internal order decisions, disputes, and policies for which no corresponding internal record has ever surfaced. Historians studying the Order have had to reconstruct significant portions of its internal 13th and 14th century governance, essentially by inference, piecing together external references rather than consulting the Order's own account of its own decisions. The mainstream explanation for this gap, and the one most Spanish medieval historians consider most probable, centers on the sheer administrative chaos and physical displacement the Order experienced during this period. The Order's headquarters moved multiple times across its history, from the original fortress of Calatrava, which itself was later judged too vulnerable and eventually abandoned in favor of the more defensible position at Calatrava la Nueva in the 1210s, following the Christian victory at Las Navas de Tolosa that finally secured the surrounding territory. Any archive maintained at the original site would have required careful transport to the new headquarters, and it is entirely plausible, given the practical difficulties of moving substantial quantities of parchment records across medieval terrain, particularly during a period when the Order remained heavily engaged in ongoing military campaigns, that a portion of the earlier archive was damaged, lost, or simply left behind during this transition. Later, disruptions compounded the problem. The 14th century brought its own share of crises to Castile, including outbreaks of plague that devastated the kingdom's population and administrative capacity generally, along with periods of civil war and succession conflict within the Castilian crown itself that inevitably disrupted the operations of institutions, like Calatrava, whose fortunes were closely tied to royal favor and protection. This practical explanation accounts for a great deal, and most professional historians studying the order treat it as the most likely primary cause of the archive's incompleteness. But it does not fully satisfy every anomaly that researchers have identified over generations of study, and it is here that the mystery deepens into more specific and more debated territory. The first significant anomaly concerns what historians refer to, somewhat informally, as the Silent Decade, a period spanning roughly the 1270s into the 1280s, during which internal order documentation becomes almost entirely absent, despite external evidence indicating the order remained highly active during this exact window. Spanish royal records from this period reference ongoing disputes between Calatrava and the rival Order of Santiago over contested territorial jurisdictions, disputes serious enough to require direct royal arbitration on multiple occasions. Papal correspondence from the same decade addresses matters of Calatrava's internal discipline and leadership succession, implying significant internal governance activity worth the papacy's direct attention. And yet, the Order's own chapter records for this specific decade are not merely incomplete, they are almost entirely absent, a gap considerably more total than the gradual attrition we might expect from ordinary archival loss spread across centuries. Why would a full decade of documentation, during a period of demonstrated institutional activity, be missing so completely, when adjacent decades, while imperfectly preserved, retain considerably more surviving material? Some historians have proposed that this specific gap reflects a genuine, documented internal crisis within the order during this period. Surviving fragmentary references suggest a serious leadership dispute, possibly involving allegations of financial mismanagement or improper conduct by order officials, serious enough that it required papal intervention to resolve. If such a dispute occurred, it raises a genuinely intriguing possibility that records documenting the crisis itself and the order's own internal deliberations about how to handle it may have been deliberately removed, destroyed, or suppressed by whichever faction ultimately prevailed in the dispute's resolution, as a way of controlling how the episode would be remembered, or perhaps of protecting individuals whose conduct during the crisis would not have reflected well on the order's reputation. This remains speculative. No direct evidence confirms deliberate destruction rather than accidental loss, but the specificity and totality of this particular gap, concentrated so precisely around a period of known internal turmoil, has struck multiple generations of researchers as a pattern too clean to be entirely coincidental. A second, related anomaly concerns the Order's financial records specifically, which show a curious and quite pointed pattern of incompleteness. The Order of Calatrava, like other major military orders of the period, derived substantial revenue not merely from agricultural estates, but from a wide range of commercial activities across Castile, including significant involvement in the wool trade that was becoming increasingly central to the Castilian economy during the 13th and 14th centuries. Surviving records document the existence of detailed financial accounting practices within the order, references to auditors, to specific accounting officials, to the general administrative apparatus one would expect from an institution managing revenue on this scale. Yet the actual detailed financial ledgers themselves, the kind of granular, transaction-level accounting that would allow historians to reconstruct precisely how the order's substantial wealth was generated, managed, and spent across the 13th and 14th centuries, survive only in fragmentary form, and are noticeably less complete than comparable administrative categories, such as land grants and property records, which survive in considerably greater volume and detail. This selective pattern of loss, administrative and property records surviving reasonably well, while financial ledgers specifically show disproportionate gaps, has led some historians to suggest a more deliberate explanation than simple accidental loss. Institutions across medieval Europe, when facing external audits, royal investigations, or transitions in leadership and oversight, occasionally had practical incentives to ensure that certain categories of financial documentation did not survive intact, particularly if that documentation might reveal practices, whether outright mismanagement or simply the ordinary financial complexities of managing a large medieval institution's revenue in ways that might not withstand outside scrutiny, that the order's leadership at various points might have preferred not to leave fully documented for posterity. Again, this remains a matter of informed speculation rather than proven fact. There is no smoking gun, no surviving document that explicitly references the deliberate destruction of financial records. But the pattern itself, disproportionate loss concentrated specifically in the category of documentation most likely to reveal uncomfortable financial detail, is one that several archivists and historians studying the order have found difficult to attribute entirely to chance. The third, and perhaps most tantalizing gap in the Calatrava archive concerns the order's final decades as an independent institution, in the years immediately preceding its 1487 incorporation into the Spanish crown under the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. This incorporation, part of a broader royal policy of absorbing Spain's powerful military orders under direct crown control, a policy that would eventually see all major Spanish military orders brought under royal administration, was a significant and, by most accounts, largely negotiated transition rather than a violent seizure. Surviving royal records document the formal process by which Calatrava's grandmastership passed to the crown, following a period of internal order dispute over succession that the Catholic monarchs skillfully exploited to advance their broader centralizing agenda. What is notably absent, however, is a substantial portion of the order's own internal records from the final years immediately preceding this transition, precisely the period during which the order's own leadership would have been most acutely aware that its independent existence was under direct threat, and would presumably have generated significant internal correspondence and deliberation about how to respond. Historians studying the crown's absorption of Calatrava have had to rely heavily on royal and papal records documenting the transition from the crown's perspective, while the order's own internal account of these critical final years remains frustratingly thin. Was this simply the product of administrative confusion during a genuinely chaotic institutional transition, records misplaced or neglected amid the practical business of transferring authority from an independent order to direct royal administration? Or does this gap, like the Silent Decade 2 centuries earlier, reflect something more deliberate, perhaps records removed or destroyed by order officials who had reason to want their final years of internal deliberation, and possibly resistance to the crown's absorption to remain undocumented? Beyond these three specific, well-studied gaps, more speculative theories have circulated among researchers and enthusiasts interested in the order's history, theories that venture further from the documented evidence and into territory that deserves to be presented with appropriate caution. Some have suggested that the missing archival material was never destroyed at all, but rather deliberately removed and preserved separately, perhaps transported to one of the order's numerous subsidiary houses and commanderies scattered across Castile and beyond, where it might have been maintained as a kind of secondary, more discreet institutional memory, accessible only to a select circle within the order's leadership. Calatrava, like other major military orders, maintained an extensive network of subordinate holdings, and it is not implausible, in purely structural terms, that sensitive documentation might have been distributed across this network rather than concentrated solely at the Order's central headquarters, though no specific subsidiary archive has been identified as the recipient of any such transferred material. Others, drawing loose comparisons to the fate of the Templars' own dissolved archive following that Order's suppression in the early 14th century, have speculated that portions of Calatrava's most sensitive records, particularly anything touching on the Order's most significant internal disputes or financial irregularities, may have been deliberately transferred outside Spain entirely during moments of institutional crisis, perhaps to sympathetic ecclesiastical contacts elsewhere in Europe, as a hedge against the possibility of forced dissolution or unfavorable royal investigation. This theory carries essentially no direct supporting evidence specific to Calatrava, and most professional historians treat it with considerably more skepticism than the more grounded, internally focused theories about selective destruction or accidental loss during periods of documented crisis. It persists nonetheless, in the way that such theories tend to persist around any institution whose surviving records don't quite match the scale of activity we know, from external sources, that institution once possessed. What makes the case of the Calatrava archive different from a simple story of medieval record loss is the sheer specificity of what's missing, set against the considerable volume of what survives. This is not an archive that has vanished entirely, leaving historians to work from scattered external references alone. Spain's National Historical Archive holds substantial Calatrava material, enough to have supported generations of serious academic study into the Order's landholdings, its military campaigns, its relationship with the Castilian crown, and its broader role in the Reconquista. The mystery lies precisely in the pattern of what's absent from that otherwise substantial record: specific decades of internal governance, disproportionate gaps in financial documentation, and a critically thin account of the Order's own final years of independent existence, each gap concentrated suspiciously around moments of known institutional stress or crisis, rather than distributed evenly across the centuries in the way ordinary accidental loss might be expected to occur. Spanish archivists and historians continue to work through the surviving Calatrava material housed in Madrid and periodic discoveries of previously uncatalogued documents, sometimes found misfiled among the records of related institutions or rediscovered during broader archival digitization projects, have occasionally filled in small pieces of these larger gaps. This ongoing, careful institutional work has, over recent decades, added meaningfully to historians' understanding of specific episodes within the Order's history that had previously relied entirely on external inference. But the larger gaps, the silent decade of the 1270s, the persistently thin financial ledgers, and the frustratingly incomplete record of the Order's final independent years, remain, even now, substantially unresolved. Perhaps, as with so many of the mysteries in this exploration, the explanation is ultimately more mundane than dramatic. Parchment decays. Archives get moved and mishandled across centuries of institutional upheaval, and the human tendency to assume deliberate concealment behind every gap in the historical record says more about our own appetite for hidden explanations than it does about what actually happened to a 14th century filing cabinet. Fires happened, floods happened, careless custodians happened in every century, in every archive across Europe. That mundane explanation deserves real weight here, but the pattern remains, for those who have spent careers studying it, difficult to entirely dismiss. Gaps that cluster precisely around moments of crisis, financial records disproportionately thinner than property records, a final decade of independent existence documented almost entirely from the outside, by the very institution that absorbed the Order rather than by the Order itself. somewhere in Castile, perhaps in the uncatalogued corners of a provincial archive, perhaps in the walls of a subsidiary commandery that has stood quietly for centuries without particular historical attention, or perhaps nowhere at all, having long since crumbled to dust in some forgotten storeroom. The missing chapters of the Order of Calatrava's own account of itself may or may not still exist. Until they surface, if they ever do, the Order's own version of its most difficult decades will remain something historians can only approach from the outside, looking in at a silence that has now lasted longer than the Order itself survived. The Order of Calatrava lost its own account of itself to fire, negligence, or perhaps deliberate concealment. But paper, however fragile, can at least theoretically survive if it's protected. Our next mystery concerns something that vanished far more completely, because the very ground it stood on ceased to exist. Somewhere beneath the gray, restless waters where the River Humber meets the North Sea, off the coast of what is now East Yorkshire, lies the drowned remains of a town that was once, by some medieval accounts, wealthier and more significant than the city of Hull itself. It was called Ravenser Odd, and its disappearance was so thorough, so complete, that today it survives almost entirely in the written record alone. A thriving medieval port that the sea simply erased, leaving historians and archaeologists to reconstruct its existence from documents describing a place that, physically, no longer exists anywhere for them to examine. To understand Ravenser Odd, we first have to understand the peculiar and treacherous geography of the Yorkshire coastline, because this mystery is unusual among those we've explored so far in that its central puzzle isn't really about missing gold, missing records through human agency, or an unexplained structure. It's about an entire settlement, with its own charter, its own members of parliament, its own bustling maritime trade, that was consumed not by war or conquest, but by the sea itself, and the specific manner and timeline of that consumption remains debated by historians and coastal geologists to this day. The Holderness coast of East Yorkshire, where the Humber estuary opens into the North Sea, is composed largely of soft glacial till, a geologically young, loosely consolidated material left behind by retreating ice sheets at the end of the last glaciation, and notoriously vulnerable to erosion. This is, in fact, one of the fastest eroding coastlines in Europe, a distinction confirmed by modern geological surveys tracking the steady, ongoing loss of land along this stretch of England even today, with some sections retreating by meters annually. In the medieval period, this same relentless erosion was actively at work, and it operated in a particularly complicated way at the mouth of the Humber, where material eroded from the coastline further north was carried by currents and redeposited as shifting sandbanks and spits near the river's mouth. A process of constant destruction in one place and constant, equally unstable creation in another. It was on one such spit of accumulated sand and silt, at the very tip of the Spurn Point Peninsula that still exists today in much altered form, that Ravenser Odd began to take shape sometime in the early 13th century. The town's name itself offers a clue to its origins and its unusual status. Odd derives from an Old Norse word meaning a spit or point of land, reflecting the Scandinavian influence still present in this region's place, names centuries after the Viking settlements that first brought Norse speakers to Yorkshire. The settlement grew, according to surviving records, with remarkable speed on what was, geologically speaking, an inherently unstable foundation, a fact that makes its subsequent commercial success all the more historically notable, and its eventual fate, in retrospect, almost inevitable. By the mid-13th century, Ravenser Odd had developed into a genuinely significant port town, and this is where we move from geological context into well-documented economic and political history. The town received a royal charter in 1299 under Edward the Firmers, granting it the right to hold a market and fair and formal status as a free borough. a designation that placed it on comparable legal footing with other significant English towns of the period. Surviving records from the period, including royal customs accounts, indicate that Ravenser Odd developed into a major trading center, particularly for the wool trade that dominated much of medieval England's export economy, with merchant ships regularly using its harbor as a base for trade connections reaching across the North Sea to ports in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and northern Germany. Some historical accounts from the period suggest that at the height of its prosperity, Ravenser Odd's customs revenue rivaled, or even exceeded that of nearby Hull, then still a relatively young settlement itself, which is a genuinely striking claim about a town built on a sandbank that had barely existed a century earlier. The town's political significance matched its commercial standing. Ravenser Odd returned its own representatives to the English Parliament beginning in 1295, a status confirming its recognized importance within the kingdom's administrative structure. The settlement supported multiple churches, according to surviving ecclesiastical records, along with the infrastructure one would expect of a genuinely established medieval port. Warehouses, a market, residential quarters for a population that some estimates, though necessarily imprecise, given the sparse surviving demographic records, suggest may have reached into the low thousands at its height. A substantial population for an English town of this period. And then, across a period of several decades in the 14th century, it simply ceased to exist. The mainstream historical and geological explanation for Ravenser Odd's disappearance is, unlike some of the mysteries we've explored, not really in serious dispute regarding the fundamental cause. The same coastal processes that had created the spit of land the town was built on, the constant erosion and redeposition of sediment along this stretch of coastline, eventually reversed in their local effect, subjecting Ravenser Odd to increasingly severe flooding and erosion rather than continued growth. Surviving records document a series of catastrophic storms and floods affecting the settlement across the middle decades of the 14th century. Consistent with the kind of severe North Sea storm surges that periodically devastated low-lying coastal settlements throughout medieval England and the wider North Sea region during this period. A 1346 petition to the Crown from Ravenser Odd's inhabitants, seeking financial relief from taxation, explicitly describes the town's distress, citing the loss of land and buildings to the encroaching sea, and requesting reduced obligations given the settlement's declining fortunes. A remarkably direct, contemporary piece of documentary evidence for what was happening to the town, and one that leaves little room to doubt the basic mechanism of the town's decline. The most severe blow appears to have come from a catastrophic storm surge event, generally dated to January 1362, known in broader English and European historical memory as the Grote Mandrenke, or Great Drowning of Men, a massive North Sea storm that caused devastating flooding and loss of life across a wide swath of coastal England, the Netherlands, and northern Germany, one of the deadliest and most destructive storm events recorded in medieval European history, with contemporary chronicles across multiple countries independently describing its severity. This storm is documented as having caused significant, possibly decisive damage to what remained of Ravenser Odd, and later 15th and 16th century sources, writing with the benefit of historical distance, described the town's final abandonment and complete submersion as essentially complete by the following decades, with some later chroniclers suggesting the physical remains of the town continued to be visible, at least partially beneath the water at low tide for some further period before disappearing entirely from view. This is, in broad outline, a well-supported and reasonably well-documented story of environmental catastrophe overtaking a genuinely prosperous medieval settlement. Not really a mystery of the same category as a hidden treasury or a suppressed archive, but rather the mystery of precise detail within a broadly understood larger event. And it's in these details, the specific unresolved questions that persist despite the clear overall narrative, that Ravenser Odd's genuine puzzles reside. The first and perhaps most fundamental unresolved question is one of simple location. Where, precisely, did Ravenser Odd stand? This might seem like a strange question to ask about a documented medieval borough with royal charters, parliamentary representation, and detailed customs records. But the coastal geography of the Humber Mouth has continued to shift so substantially in the centuries since the town's disappearance that pinpointing its exact original location with confidence has proven genuinely difficult for historians and marine archaeologists alike. The modern Spurn Point Peninsula, while occupying roughly the same general area, is itself a geologically distinct feature from the medieval landscape Ravenser Odd was built upon, having been reshaped by the same ongoing processes of erosion and redeposition across the intervening centuries. Some coastal geologists studying historical maps and records place the town's likely location somewhat further out into what is now open water than the current peninsula extends, while others argue for a position closer to the existing shoreline. Without confident location data, systematic underwater archaeological investigation, of the kind that has successfully documented other submerged medieval and ancient sites elsewhere in European waters, has proven considerably more difficult to organize and conduct for Ravenser Odd specifically, leaving the physical remnants of the town, if any meaningfully identifiable remnants survive at all after nearly 7 centuries of tidal action and further coastal change, effectively unlocated in any precise sense. This uncertainty extends to a second related question that has occupied historians studying the town. What, if anything, survives materially of Ravenser Odd beneath the water, and what happened to it during the town's final decades of decline? Unlike a settlement destroyed suddenly by fire or violence, Ravenser Odd's decline unfolded, according to the documentary record, across several decades of gradual and then accelerating loss, giving inhabitants at least some warning and opportunity to remove valuable and portable property before final abandonment. The 1346 petition itself implies an ongoing managed process of decline rather than sudden catastrophe, suggesting that at least some inhabitants relocated, presumably to Hull and other nearby settlements, over an extended period, likely taking with them whatever movable wealth, goods, and materials could be salvaged. This means that whatever remains beneath the water today, if meaningful archaeological remains survive at all given the destructive power of nearly 7 centuries of tidal action on this particular stretch of coastline, likely represents only what could not be moved or what was lost during the town's final, most catastrophic flooding events, rather than a complete snapshot of the settlement's material culture at its height. Given this, what did happen to the portable wealth of a town that customs records suggest was, at its peak, a seriously significant trading center? Did the bulk of it relocate successfully to Hull and other nearby settlements as the town's population gradually dispersed, becoming absorbed into the ordinary economic life of the surrounding region without leaving any particularly distinct historical trace of its Ravenser Odd origins? This is, in fact, the explanation most historians consider most probable, consistent with what we generally understand about how medieval populations responded to gradual environmental decline in coastal settlements elsewhere in Europe during this period. Relocation and adaptation, rather than catastrophic total loss. But the specific documentary trail confirming exactly where Ravenser Odd's population and wealth ultimately went is considerably thinner than we might expect for a town of its documented significance, a gap that, as with several of our previous mysteries, likely reflects the ordinary incompleteness of medieval record-keeping generally, rather than anything more deliberate or unusual, but which nonetheless leaves specific questions without confident answers. It's at this point, with the fundamental narrative of environmental catastrophe well established, but specific details persistently unresolved, that more speculative theories and popular local traditions have found room to develop. Local Yorkshire folklore concerning the Holderness Coast, an area that has lost numerous other medieval settlements to the same relentless erosion processes that consumed Ravenser Odd, though few with quite Ravenser Odd's documented former significance, includes persistent stories of church bells still audible beneath the waves during storms, said to ring out from the submerged remains of the town's lost churches, a folkloric motif that appears, in various forms, attached to numerous drowned or lost coastal settlements across England and indeed across Northern Europe more broadly, making it difficult to treat as evidence specific to Ravenser Odd itself, rather than a more generalized piece of coastal folklore that has simply attached itself to this particular lost town over the centuries, as such stories often do. More substantively, some historians and amateur researchers interested in the town have speculated about the possibility that a portion of Ravenser Odd's wealth, rather than being successfully relocated during the town's gradual decline, may have been lost specifically during the town's most severe and sudden storm events, the Grote Mandrenke in particular, catching inhabitants without sufficient warning to fully evacuate valuable goods before catastrophic flooding struck. Given that this storm is independently documented across multiple countries as having caused sudden, severe, and in many locations largely unanticipated devastation, this is not an unreasonable speculation in principle. Whether any meaningful concentration of medieval material culture, coin, trade goods, or ecclesiastical valuables from the town's churches might have survived nearly 7 centuries of subsequent tidal action, storm activity, and the general destructive power of the North Sea environment in any archaeologically recoverable form is, however, a considerably more open question, one that underwater archaeologists studying comparable submerged medieval sites elsewhere have found genuinely difficult to answer with confidence even under more favorable preservation conditions than this particularly harsh stretch of English coastline is likely to offer. A further, more genuinely uncertain question concerns the fate of the town's ecclesiastical institutions specifically. Surviving records reference multiple churches within Ravenser Odd, and medieval churches, even in relatively modest settlements, frequently held accumulated wealth in the form of plate, vestments, and religious artifacts donated by parishioners across generations. Did the clergy and congregations of these churches successfully remove their most valuable possessions during the town's gradual decline, as we might reasonably expect given the extended warning period the documentary record suggests the town experienced? Or did some portion of this accumulated ecclesiastical wealth, like the church bells of local legend, remain in place until final catastrophic flooding overtook it? No specific documentary record confirming either outcome has been identified by historians studying the town, leaving this particular question, like so much else about Ravenser Odd's final years, genuinely open. What makes Ravenser Odd distinct among the mysteries we've explored is that its central uncertainty isn't really about competing theories of what happened, in the way that debates over hidden treasuries or suppressed archives typically unfold. The fundamental cause of the town's disappearance, gradual and then catastrophic coastal erosion and flooding culminating in the Grote Mandrenke and its aftermath, is about as well established as medieval environmental history generally allows. The genuine mystery here is one of physical absence in the most literal sense. An entire documented medieval borough, with royal charters and parliamentary representation and customs records confirming its serious commercial significance, that has left behind essentially no directly examinable physical trace, because the very ground it stood on no longer exists in any locatable, stable form. Historians can read about Ravenser Odd in remarkable documentary detail. They simply cannot walk its streets, examine its foundations, or excavate its churches, because the North Sea absorbed the physical town so completely, and the coastline has shifted so substantially in the centuries since, that even confidently identifying where to look has proven a persistent challenge. Modern coastal monitoring and marine geological survey work continues along the Holderness coast, driven primarily by contemporary concerns about ongoing erosion threatening current infrastructure and communities, rather than by any dedicated search for Ravenser Odd specifically. This ongoing work occasionally yields data relevant to reconstructing the historical coastline's likely configuration during the medieval period, incrementally refining historians' and geologists' best estimates of where the lost town most probably stood. But a confident, thoroughly investigated answer, the kind that might finally allow marine archaeologists to conduct the kind of systematic underwater investigation that has successfully illuminated other lost coastal settlements elsewhere in Europe, remains, even now, out of reach. Perhaps Ravenser Odd's true fate is exactly what the documentary record already tells us: a prosperous medieval town built too ambitiously on ground that was never meant to be permanent, gradually and then suddenly reclaimed by the same restless sea that had first created the sandbank it stood upon, its population dispersing sensibly to more stable ground, its wealth mostly saved, its physical remains scattered and dissolved by 7 centuries of tide and storm until nothing distinct enough to locate survives. That is, in all likelihood, close to the truth. But somewhere beneath the gray water off the Yorkshire coast, in sediment that has shifted and resettled countless times since the 14th century, the precise physical remnants of a town that once rivaled Hull in its prosperity may still lie waiting, not hidden by any human hand or deliberate concealment, but simply lost beneath a sea that has never stopped moving and has never yet given up precisely where to look. The North Sea that swallowed Ravenser Odd has claimed countless secrets across the centuries, but not every mystery in this exploration lies beneath water or sand. Some are buried instead beneath layers of legend so thick that separating fact from embellishment becomes its own investigation. We travel now to a battlefield in northern England, to a single day in September of 1066 that changed the course of English history twice within a matter of weeks, and to the still unresolved question of what became of the royal regalia belonging to one of the most extraordinary warrior kings of the entire Viking Age, Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, King of Norway. To understand why this mystery persists, we first have to understand who Harald was, and here the documented history is genuinely remarkable, requiring very little embellishment to seem larger than life. Born around 1015, Harald fled Norway as a teenager following the defeat of his half-brother, King Olaf II, at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, beginning an extraordinary period of exile that took him first to the court of Kievan Rus, where he served Prince Yaroslav the Wise, and then, remarkably, into the service of the Byzantine Empire itself, joining the elite Varangian Guard, the famous corps of primarily Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Byzantine and Norse sources alike, including the later Norse sagas and contemporary Byzantine administrative records, confirm that Harald rose to genuine prominence within this service, campaigning across the Mediterranean, in Sicily, and reportedly as far as the Holy Land, accumulating both military reputation and, according to saga tradition, substantial personal wealth through his share of Byzantine campaign spoils. By 1046, Harald had returned to Scandinavia, and through a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlement, secured joint kingship of Norway alongside his nephew Magnus, becoming sole king of Norway following Magnus's death the following year. He ruled Norway for nearly 2 decades, a reign well documented in both contemporary and near-contemporary sources, including detailed treatment in the later Norse sagas, particularly Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, composed in the 13th century but drawing on earlier oral and written traditions. Harald's reign was marked by the consolidation of royal authority within Norway, ongoing conflict with Denmark, and the kind of ambitious, aggressive kingship that had earned him his epithet. This was, by any reasonable historical assessment, one of the most well-traveled, battle-hardened, and internationally connected monarchs of the entire Viking Age, a man who had served an emperor in Constantinople before ruling as king in his own right in Norway. It was Harald's final campaign, launched in the late summer of 1066, that would end both his reign and his life, and that sets the stage for our mystery. Sensing opportunity in the disputed English succession following the death of Edward the Confessor earlier that year, Harald sailed for England with a substantial invasion fleet, allying with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the newly crowned English king, Harald Godwinson. The invasion began with initial success. Harald's forces defeated a hastily assembled English army at the Battle of Fulford near York on the 20th of September, a victory confirmed across multiple English and Norse sources. But English King Harald Godwinson responded with extraordinary speed, marching his own forces north with remarkable haste and catching Harald's army largely by surprise at Stamford Bridge, just outside York, on the 25th of September 1066. The battle that followed is among the better documented military engagements of the entire period, described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in later Norse saga tradition, and referenced in subsequent Norman sources compiled in the years following the more famous Battle of Hastings that would follow just weeks later. Harald Hardrada was killed during the fighting, reportedly struck by an arrow to the throat according to saga tradition, though, as with many battlefield deaths from this period, the precise details come to us filtered through sources composed somewhat after the fact and shaped by the narrative conventions of saga literature. What is not in serious historical dispute is the outcome. Harald's forces were decisively defeated, the king himself was killed, and the survivors of his invasion fleet, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, required only a fraction of the ships that had originally carried them to England in order to carry the survivors back to Norway, a detail suggesting catastrophic losses. This is where documented history provides us with a clear narrative, and where our mystery genuinely begins, because the question of what became of Harald's personal regalia, his crown and the symbols of Norwegian royal authority that a king of his stature and international experience would very plausibly have carried with him on campaign, is one that the surviving sources simply do not directly address in any detail that has survived to us. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what we actually know, and what we're reconstructing from reasonable inference, because this distinction matters more for this particular mystery than for some others in our exploration. Unlike the well-documented treasury of the Teutonic Order, or the royal court financial apparatus of Owain Glyndŵr, we do not possess detailed contemporary inventories of Harald Hardrada's personal regalia, no equivalent to the account books that let historians reconstruct Malbork's treasury with reasonable confidence. What we have instead is a strong circumstantial case built from what we know generally about medieval Scandinavian kingship and about Harald's own documented wealth and status specifically. Norse sagas, including Heimskringla's detailed account of Harald's reign, repeatedly emphasize his substantial personal wealth, much of it, according to saga tradition, accumulated during his years of Byzantine service and campaigns across the Mediterranean, wealth that would have been extraordinary by contemporary Scandinavian standards. Saga sources describe Harald as notably status-conscious, a king who understood the symbolic and political importance of visible wealth and royal display, having spent years in the sophisticated, ceremonially elaborate court culture of Constantinople before returning to rule in Norway. It would be, by the general standards of medieval kingship across Europe during this period, genuinely unusual for a monarch of Harold's international experience and documented wealth to have embarked on a major invasion campaign, one explicitly intended to claim the English crown for himself, without bringing symbols of his own royal authority, quite possibly including a crown or diadem of the kind Norse and broader European royal tradition associated with kingship, along with other regalia appropriate to a king pressing a formal claim to a foreign throne. This is the foundation of the mystery, and it's important to be honest about its nature. It rests substantially on reasonable historical inference about what a king of Harold's documented character and circumstances would very plausibly have carried, rather than on direct contemporary documentation confirming that he did so, or describing what happened to such regalia after his death. This distinguishes it somewhat from mysteries like the Teutonic Treasury, where we have detailed account books confirming a treasury's prior existence and scale. Here, we're working from strong circumstantial reasoning about probability, layered beneath centuries of subsequent legend that has, understandably, filled in the gaps with considerably more confidence than the underlying sources fully support. What happened to Harold's body and immediate possessions following his death at Stamford Bridge is somewhat better, though still incompletely documented. Norse tradition holds that Harold's remains were eventually returned to Norway for burial, reportedly at a church he himself had founded in Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim, then serving as Norway's ecclesiastical and political center. If this tradition is accurate, and it's treated as plausible by most historians studying the period, it would imply that at least some organized effort was made to recover and repatriate the king's body following the catastrophic defeat, presumably undertaken by surviving members of his retinue during the same difficult withdrawal that saw the bulk of his invasion fleet return to Norway. Whether any personal regalia accompanied this repatriation remained on the battlefield to be claimed by the victorious English forces, or was lost during the evidently chaotic retreat, is not something the surviving sources directly address. The mainstream historical position, to the extent one exists on a question this specific and this thinly documented, holds that any regalia Harold carried on campaign most likely met one of several unremarkable fates. It may have been claimed as battlefield spoils by Harold Godwinson's victorious forces, following the ordinary medieval practice of treating a defeated enemy's possessions as legitimate plunder, subsequently melted down, redistributed, or otherwise absorbed into the material culture of 11th century England without leaving any specific, traceable record of its ultimate fate, a pattern common enough for battlefield spoils generally across this period that its absence from the record would not, on its own, be especially surprising. Alternatively, if Harold's household and closest retainers managed a more organized retreat than the fleet's overall losses might suggest, personal regalia small enough to transport, unlike an army, might plausibly have been successfully recovered and returned to Norway along with the king's body, eventually passing into the possession of his son and successor, Olaf Kyrre, and from there into the ordinary, largely undocumented churn of medieval Norwegian royal treasure across subsequent reigns, wars, and church reformations. Any specific trace of an object originally associated with Harold himself simply blurring into the broader, poorly documented history of medieval Norwegian royal treasure generally. Both explanations are plausible. Neither can be confirmed with the kind of documentary confidence that has allowed historians studying, for instance, the Teutonic Order's treasury to at least establish a clear baseline of what existed before turning to the harder question of exactly where it went. This is, in an important sense, a different kind of mystery than most others we've explored in this series. Not so much a documented loss with an unclear cause, but an object whose very existence, while historically plausible and consistent with everything we know about Harold's status and character, was never definitively documented to begin with, leaving its subsequent fate almost entirely speculative by necessity. It's in this space, where documented history offers strong circumstantial plausibility but no direct confirmation, that legend and popular tradition have, understandably, taken hold more firmly than in some of our other mysteries. Norwegian folk tradition, developed and elaborated across the centuries following Harald's death, includes various local legends attaching themselves to specific locations, some claiming that Harald's most valuable regalia never left Norway at all, having been deliberately left behind or hidden prior to the English campaign, perhaps as a precaution given the evident risks of the invasion he was undertaking. A king experienced enough in warfare to have understood that even a campaign launched with confidence might end badly. Other traditions, considerably more speculative and generally treated with more skepticism even within the broader body of folklore surrounding Harald, suggest that regalia associated with his years of Byzantine service specifically, potentially including items of considerably greater material value than typical Norse royal symbols, given the sophistication and wealth of the Byzantine court he had served, may have been separately secured somewhere in Norway prior to the 1066 campaign, distinct from whatever more traditional Norwegian royal symbols he carried with him to England. Archaeological work in Norway relevant to Harald's reign has, over the past century and more, uncovered various finds broadly consistent with the wealth and international connections his documented biography would suggest, including metalwork and artifacts showing Byzantine and broader Mediterranean stylistic influence in regions associated with his rule, though no specific find has been confidently and specifically identified as regalia belonging to Harald personally, a level of specific attribution that the surviving evidence generally doesn't support for finds from this period, regardless of their broader historical plausibility. This is worth being clear about. Interesting. Historically consistent archaeological finds are not the same as confirmed identification, and responsible historians and archaeologists studying medieval Norway are generally careful to maintain that distinction, however tempting a more definitive connection to a figure as compelling as Harald Hardrada might be. More speculative theories still, circulating primarily within popular treasure hunting and amateur historical circles rather than academic scholarship, have proposed that some portion of Harald's regalia or personal wealth may have remained in England following Stamford Bridge, hidden or buried by surviving members of his retinue during the chaotic retreat to the ships, perhaps in the general vicinity of York, or along the route back toward the coast, rather than either being captured as spoils or successfully repatriated to Norway. This theory finds some general support in the simple logistical plausibility of a defeated army moving quickly to escape pursuit, choosing to conceal rather than attempt to transport valuable but non-essential items during a hasty withdrawal, a pattern documented in other medieval military retreats across Europe. But it remains, like the Norwegian traditions of concealment prior to departure, entirely unconfirmed by any specific archaeological or documentary evidence, resting on general plausibility rather than direct support. What makes this mystery genuinely distinct within our broader exploration is this foundational uncertainty about the object itself, layered beneath the uncertainty about its fate. We are reasonably confident, based on strong circumstantial and comparative historical reasoning, that Harald Hardrada, an internationally experienced, demonstrably wealthy king, pressing an active claim to a foreign throne, likely carried some meaningful regalia with him on his final campaign. We do not possess the kind of direct documentary confirmation that would elevate this from strong probability to established fact, and we possess essentially no reliable information about what specifically happened to any such regalia following his death at Stamford Bridge, only the broader, well-documented outcome of catastrophic military defeat and a difficult, loss-heavy retreat. This combination, genuine historical plausibility resting on a foundation of documented character and circumstance, paired with an almost complete absence of specific confirming detail about the object's existence or fate, is precisely the kind of gap that popular historical imagination tends to fill with confidence the underlying evidence doesn't fully support. It would be easy, in telling this story, to present Harald's missing crown as an established historical fact with a genuinely unresolved fate, in the manner of the Teutonic Order's well-documented treasury. That would not be entirely honest to what the surviving sources actually tell us. The more accurate, and in some ways more genuinely interesting position, is that we're dealing here with a mystery about historical inference itself. How confident can we reasonably be about an object's existence based on strong contextual and comparative reasoning when direct contemporary documentation simply never survived, or perhaps never existed in the specific, itemized form that would satisfy a modern historian's evidentiary standards? Scholars of the Viking Age and of 11th century Scandinavian and English history continued to study Harald Hardrada's remarkable career, and archaeological work relevant to his reign continues in Norway, gradually refining our broader understanding of the material, culture, and wealth associated with his court and era. Whether any of this work will ever produce a find specific and well-documented enough to move the question of Harald's regalia from plausible inference to established fact remains, for now, an open question, in a rather different sense than most of the mysteries we've explored in this series. Perhaps the truth is that no single identifiable crown or set of Byzantine-influenced regalia ever existed in the specific, singular form that legend has since imagined, and that Harald, like most Norse kings of his era, traveled with wealth and symbols of authority that were real and valuable, but never quite as singular or dramatically documentable as later storytelling has suggested. Or perhaps, in a Norwegian church treasury, lost to later reformation and reorganization, or in English ground somewhere along the retreat route from Stamford Bridge, or simply melted down and redistributed within a generation of the battle in the ordinary, undramatic way medieval wealth so often was. Something that once adorned the head of a king who had served an emperor and ruled a kingdom still waits, unidentified and unclaimed, for evidence specific enough to finally separate what we can reasonably infer from what we can actually prove. Where Harald Hardrada's regalia may or may not have existed in the form legend imagines, our next mystery concerns something far more solid and far more visible. An entire hilltop city, whose walls, cathedral, and castle once dominated the Wiltshire landscape, and whose complete abandonment within a single generation remains, even with a documented primary cause, a puzzle whose finer details continue to occupy historians and archaeologists. Rising from the chalk downland just north of modern Salisbury, the grass-covered ramparts of Old Sarum still trace the outline of a settlement that, for over a century, served as one of medieval England's most important religious and administrative centers, before its population walked away entirely, leaving behind a hilltop that, within decades, had been stripped of nearly every stone. The site itself carries a history considerably older than the medieval settlement that concerns us here, and understanding that deeper history helps explain why Old Sarum became what it did. The hill had served as a fortified position since the Iron Age, its earthworks reflecting occupation stretching back well over 2,000 years, and the Romans later established a settlement here as well, recognizing, as so many occupiers before and after them would, the strategic value of a defensible chalk hill commanding the surrounding countryside and its river valleys. Following the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror recognized the same strategic logic that had drawn every previous occupant to this hilltop, and Old Sarum entered its most significant historical period, becoming the site of a royal castle and, critically for our story, the seat of a newly established bishopric, with construction of a cathedral beginning in the 1070s under Bishop Osmond. This is where Old Sarum's documented medieval history becomes genuinely substantial and worth understanding in some detail before we turn to its eventual, more puzzling decline. The cathedral at Old Sarum, consecrated in 1092, quickly became one of the most important religious institutions in southern England. And it was here, in the final years of the 11th century, that a genuinely significant piece of English administrative history unfolded. The compilation and presentation of the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's extraordinary survey of English landholdings, is recorded as having been formally presented to the king at Old Sarum in 1086, an event confirming the site's status as a genuine center of royal and ecclesiastical authority during this critical early period of Norman rule. Over the following century, Old Sarum continued to develop as both a religious and military center, its cathedral serving as the seat of the Bishop of Salisbury, its castle maintained as a significant royal fortification, and a civilian settlement growing around both institutions to support their considerable administrative and economic needs. By any reasonable historical measure, Old Sarum in the 12th century was a place of genuine importance. A cathedral city, a royal castle, home to a bishop, a garrison, and a civilian population supporting both, situated at a strategically significant crossing of routes through Wiltshire. And yet, within roughly a century of reaching this height of significance, the entire settlement had been abandoned, its population relocated to an entirely new site nearby, its buildings systematically dismantled for building materials until little more than earthworks and foundation traces remained. This relocation is, in its broad outline, one of the more thoroughly documented urban transitions of medieval England, which makes the specific texture of why it happened, and why it happened in the particular way it did, all the more worth examining carefully. The immediate documented catalyst for Old Sarum's abandonment centers on a genuine, well-recorded conflict between the cathedral clergy and the castle garrison that shared this confined hilltop site. A tension that surviving records suggest had been building for decades before finally reaching a breaking point in the early 13th century. Old Sarum's hilltop location, chosen originally for its defensive strategic value, created real and increasingly intolerable practical difficulties for the cathedral community specifically. The site's elevated, exposed position meant the cathedral and its surrounding ecclesiastical buildings were subject to severe weather, with contemporary accounts describing conditions inside the cathedral as sometimes so affected by wind that services were reportedly difficult to conduct. The building itself apparently suffering structural stress from its exposed hilltop position over the decades since its late 11th century construction. More significantly, the shared confined space of the hilltop site meant clergy and the castle's military garrison existed in uncomfortably close proximity, and surviving records describe genuine friction between the two communities, including specific complaints that the garrison sometimes restricted the clergy's access to the site or interfered with cathedral business. Tensions serious enough that they're documented in contemporary ecclesiastical correspondence rather than existing merely as later, embellished tradition. Water supply presented a further, well-documented practical problem. Old Sarum's chalk hilltop location, while excellent for defense, offered poor access to reliable water sources, a genuine and serious limitation for a growing settlement, and contemporary and near-contemporary sources reference the difficulty and expense of maintaining adequate water access for the cathedral community and broader settlement as a real, ongoing practical burden. Combined with the increasing physical constraints of the site itself, which offered little room for the cathedral community to expand as its administrative and residential needs grew across the 12th century, these accumulated practical difficulties created genuine pressure for relocation that appears, based on the surviving documentary record, considerably more substantial and more directly causal than a single dramatic dispute might suggest. This pressure culminated in a formal, well-documented decision. Bishop Richard Poore, who took up the position in 1217, is credited in contemporary and near-contemporary ecclesiastical records with formally pursuing relocation of the cathedral to a new site in the valley below, securing papal authorization for the move in 1219 and beginning construction of an entirely new cathedral at what would become New Sarum, the settlement that has grown into modern Salisbury, starting in 1220. This is genuinely well-documented history, confirmed by surviving papal correspondence, cathedral records, and the physical evidence of the new cathedral's construction itself, which proceeded across the following decades on a scale and with an architectural coherence that historians of medieval English ecclesiastical architecture consistently identify as among the finest and most unified examples of the early English Gothic style, precisely because, unlike many medieval cathedrals built and rebuilt piecemeal across centuries, Salisbury Cathedral was constructed largely as a single, sustained building campaign, free from the physical constraints that had so troubled its predecessor. Given this genuinely substantial documentary record, explaining both the practical grievances driving relocation and the formal ecclesiastical process by which it was accomplished, where exactly does the mystery lie? It's a fair question, and one worth answering honestly. Old Sarum's abandonment is not, in its fundamental cause, a genuine historical enigma in the way that, say, the fate of Owain Glyndŵr's Treasury remains genuinely unresolved. The cathedral's relocation to Salisbury is about as well documented as any major medieval institutional move in English history. But the desertion of Old Sarum encompasses more than just the cathedral's departure, and it's in the broader, less thoroughly documented questions surrounding the site's complete and remarkably thorough physical abandonment that genuine, still debated puzzles remain. The first significant question concerns timing and completeness. While the cathedral's relocation is precisely dated and thoroughly documented, the castle and its associated garrison, along with whatever civilian population had grown up specifically to serve the castle's needs rather than the cathedral's, followed a considerably less well-documented trajectory. Old Sarum's castle continued to see at least some use following the cathedral's departure, but the precise timeline of its own decline and eventual complete abandonment is considerably less clear, with surviving records offering only fragmentary and sometimes contradictory indications of exactly when and how thoroughly the castle and its associated settlement were finally vacated. Some historians place the castle's effective abandonment within a few decades of the cathedral's departure, while others have argued for a more gradual decline extending across a longer period into the 14th century, pointing to fragmentary evidence of continued, if diminished, activity at the site. Without more complete surviving administrative records specifically addressing the castle's later medieval history, this timeline question remains genuinely open to differing scholarly interpretation. The second, and in some ways more genuinely puzzling question, concerns the sheer thoroughness of the site's physical stripping following its abandonment. It's not unusual, in medieval England and elsewhere across Europe, for abandoned settlements to be gradually stripped of reusable building materials by nearby communities, stone being a valuable and labor-intensive resource that made perfect practical sense to salvage from disused structures rather than quarry fresh. This ordinary process of material salvage is well documented at numerous abandoned medieval sites across England. But the degree to which Old Sarum was stripped, to the point that relatively little standing structure survived above ground level within a few centuries of abandonment, struck early antiquarians studying the site, and continues to strike some archaeologists today as somewhat more thorough and more rapid than typical gradual salvage alone might fully explain, particularly for structures as substantial as a cathedral and a significant royal castle, built from materials requiring real skill and effort to quarry and dress originally. The most straightforward explanation, and the one most archaeologists studying the site consider probably sufficient on its own, points to the practical logistics of the new cathedral's construction at Salisbury itself. Building an entirely new cathedral of the scale and architectural ambition that Salisbury represents required an enormous quantity of building stone, and Old Sarum, sitting only a few miles away and already possessing a substantial quantity of quarried, dressed stone in its now redundant cathedral and associated buildings, would have represented an obviously convenient and economically sensible source of materials for the new construction project, avoiding the considerable expense and labor of fresh quarrying for at least a portion of the new building's needs. This explanation, essentially organized, deliberate material recycling directly connected to the new cathedral's construction needs, rather than merely gradual, opportunistic salvage by unrelated later communities, would account reasonably well for both the thoroughness and the relative speed of Old Sarum's physical stripping, and is consistent with what we know generally about medieval building practices, where reusing available dressed stone from nearby disused structures was standard, sensible practice rather than any kind of unusual or notable circumstance. Yet this explanation, while probably substantially correct, doesn't fully resolve every aspect of what archaeological investigation at the site has revealed. Excavations conducted at Old Sarum across the 19th and 20th centuries, and continuing archaeological interest in the site more recently, have documented not just the expected stripping of easily accessible above-ground stone, but evidence of more extensive foundation-level disturbance in certain areas than straightforward stone salvage for the new cathedral would necessarily require, particularly around portions of the site associated with the castle rather than the cathedral itself, whose stone would presumably have been the more immediately relevant resource for the new cathedral's specifically ecclesiastical construction needs. Why would foundation-level castle structures, whose stone would have been less immediately relevant to cathedral construction specifically, show comparably thorough disturbance to the cathedral remains themselves? Some archaeologists have suggested this may simply reflect later, separate salvage activity connected to the ordinary growth of Salisbury as a town in its own right across the following centuries, its own expanding population drawing on Old Sarum as a convenient general stone source for entirely unrelated, later building projects extending well beyond the initial cathedral construction. This remains, on balance, the most probable explanation, requiring no unusual circumstances beyond the ordinary, extended practical logic of nearby communities, treating a conveniently located, already quarried stone source as exactly that for generations after the original cathedral relocation. A further, genuinely more speculative line of inquiry concerns what, if anything, might remain beneath ground level at the site that more extensive modern archaeological investigation has not yet fully addressed. English Heritage, which maintains and manages Old Sarum today, has conducted various surveys and limited excavations across the site over recent decades, work that has added meaningfully to our understanding of the settlement's layout and construction phases without, however, constituting the kind of comprehensive, total excavation that might definitively resolve every remaining question about the site's later medieval history and final decline. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques, increasingly standard tools for heritage sites where full excavation isn't practical or desirable, have identified some subsurface features at Old Sarum not fully accounted for by currently understood building phases, though heritage authorities have, appropriately, been cautious about drawing firm conclusions from such preliminary survey data without the more thorough investigation that would be required to properly interpret what these features actually represent. This has left room, as it so often does, for more speculative theories to circulate among those with particular interest in the site. Theories considerably more tentative than the well-documented core narrative of ecclesiastical relocation. Some have wondered whether portions of the castle's later medieval history, less thoroughly documented than the cathedral's precisely dated departure, might include episodes of use or activity not fully captured in the surviving administrative record, given how comparatively thin documentation of the castle's specific final decades appears relative to the richly documented cathedral relocation. Others, drawing on the site's considerably longer history as a fortified position, stretching back to the Iron Age, have speculated about whether earlier, pre-medieval features of the site might still lie substantially unexplored beneath later medieval construction. A genuinely plausible possibility for any site with occupation layers this deep and this varied, though one that speaks more to the site's remarkable multi-period significance generally than to any specific unresolved mystery about its medieval abandonment particularly. What Old Sarum ultimately offers, then, is a somewhat different kind of mystery than several others we've explored in this series. Not a central puzzle about fundamental cause, since the reasons for the cathedral's relocation are about as clearly documented as medieval English ecclesiastical history allows, but rather a series of smaller, genuinely unresolved questions clustered around the edges of an otherwise well-understood central narrative. When, precisely, was the castle finally and completely abandoned? Why does foundation-level disturbance extend so thoroughly into areas whose connection to the new cathedral's construction needs seems less immediately obvious? And what, if anything, remains to be found beneath a site that has been studied by antiquarians and archaeologists for well over a century, without ever having received the kind of truly comprehensive, total excavation that might finally settle every remaining question? Today, Old Sarum stands as a genuinely striking landscape feature, its massive earthwork ramparts still clearly visible, enclosing grassy foundations that trace, in outline, the ghost of a cathedral and castle that once dominated this stretch of Wiltshire, before its population made the entirely sensible, well-documented decision to move somewhere with better water, more room to grow, and considerably less friction between the clergy who prayed there and the soldiers who defended it. That decision, and the magnificent cathedral it eventually produced down in the valley below, represents one of medieval England's clearer stories, a rational institutional response to genuine, well-recorded practical grievances. But clarity about the central decision doesn't mean every stone tells its complete story. Somewhere beneath that grass-covered hilltop, in the layers between Iron Age earthwork and medieval foundation, in whatever subsurface features modern survey technology has flagged but not yet fully investigated, Old Sarum may still hold details that could refine, or perhaps complicate, the otherwise well-understood story of why an entire cathedral city walked away from its hilltop and never looked back. Old Sarum was abandoned by choice, its stones carried away for a purpose its own community understood and approved. Our final approach to this exploration takes us to a site that met a far more violent end, one where destruction came not from practical necessity but from royal decree and religious upheaval, and where, amid the wreckage of one of medieval England's wealthiest and most legendary monasteries, a single object of considerable size and considerable fame simply vanishes from the historical record. This is the story of Glastonbury Abbey, and of the great bell that tradition holds once called its monks to prayer, and whose fate remains, even amid the Abbey's otherwise thoroughly documented destruction, genuinely unresolved. Glastonbury Abbey, rising from the low-lying Somerset levels in southwestern England, occupied a position in medieval English religious and cultural life that few other institutions could match. By the time of its dissolution in the 16th century, Glastonbury had accumulated a documented history stretching back, according to the Abbey's own tradition and early medieval sources, to the earliest years of Christianity in Britain, with later medieval legend elaborating this ancient pedigree into claims connecting the site to Joseph of Arimathea, and eventually through the particularly influential medieval literary tradition that developed around the site in the 12th century, to the legendary King Arthur himself, whose supposed grave, along with that of Queen Guinevere, monks at Glastonbury claimed to have discovered in 1191, a discovery that dramatically boosted the Abbey's prestige and pilgrim revenue, and one that most modern historians treat with considerable skepticism as a probable medieval invention, convenient in its timing for an institution that had recently suffered a devastating fire and stood in genuine need of funds and renewed prestige to support its rebuilding. Setting aside the more legendary elements of Glastonbury's self-mythology, which have been thoroughly and appropriately scrutinized by generations of historians and archaeologists, the Abbey's documented medieval history is nonetheless genuinely impressive on its own, well-evidenced terms. By the later medieval period, Glastonbury had become one of the wealthiest monastic houses in England, its extensive landholdings across Somerset and beyond generating substantial revenue. Its buildings, rebuilt on a grand scale following the 1184 fire that had destroyed much of the earlier Saxon and Norman structure, representing some of the finest ecclesiastical architecture in the West Country. Surviving records, including detailed accounts compiled at the time of the Abbey's dissolution, confirm Glastonbury's position among the very wealthiest religious houses in England, its annual income placing it consistently among the top handful of English monasteries by the early 16th century. This wealth and prominence made Glastonbury, like England's other great monasteries, a direct target during the dissolution of the monasteries carried out under Henry VIII beginning in the late 1530s, part of the broader English Reformation that saw the systematic closure, and frequently the deliberate physical destruction, of monastic institutions across the kingdom, their considerable landholdings and accumulated wealth absorbed into the crown's coffers. Glastonbury's dissolution, which occurred in 1539, was among the more dramatic and violent examples of this broader process, and it is here that documented history provides us with genuinely well-recorded, if genuinely disturbing, detail. Abbot Richard Whiting, who had led the Abbey for nearly 2 decades, refused to voluntarily surrender the institution to royal commissioners, a resistance that ended in his trial on fabricated charges of treason and his execution, along with 2 of his monks, by hanging on the summit of Glastonbury Tor, the dramatic conical hill overlooking the Abbey that remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in the entire region, a site whose visibility across the surrounding countryside would have made the execution a deliberately public, visible demonstration of royal authority to the entire district. Following the abbot's execution, the Abbey itself was systematically stripped and largely dismantled, its lead roofing melted down, its valuable furnishings and plate confiscated by royal commissioners, its buildings left to gradual ruin, and, as with old Sarum before it, subsequent generations of local stone salvage that reduced much of the once magnificent complex to the evocative ruins that survive today. This entire process, the dissolution itself, Abbot Whiting's resistance and execution, and the Abbey's subsequent physical stripping, is documented in genuinely substantial detail, drawing on royal commissioners' own reports, contemporary and near-contemporary chronicle accounts, and the physical archaeological evidence of the ruins themselves, which have been extensively studied since serious antiquarian interest in the site developed from the 18th century onward. It is against this well-documented backdrop of institutional destruction that the more specific, more genuinely uncertain question of the Abbey's Great Bell arises. Medieval monasteries of Glastonbury's size and wealth maintained substantial bell towers, and surviving records from other comparably wealthy English monastic houses confirm that major abbeys frequently possessed multiple bells of significant size, cast specifically for the institution, and often, given the genuine expense and skill required in medieval bell founding, representing objects of considerable value in their own right, quite apart from their obvious religious and practical function in calling the community to prayer and marking the hours of monastic life. Local tradition and later historical accounts concerning Glastonbury specifically reference a bell of particular size and reputation, sometimes associated in later folklore with the Abbey's most celebrated building phases under earlier medieval abbots, though it should be said plainly that the specific documentary trail confirming this particular bell's precise origins, its exact size, and its documented history prior to the dissolution is considerably thinner than, for instance, the documentation surrounding the Abbey's overall wealth and landholdings, which survive in genuinely detailed royal and monastic records. What we can establish with reasonable confidence, based on the general pattern well documented at other dissolved English monasteries of comparable size, is that Glastonbury's bells, whatever their specific individual histories, would have represented valuable objects that royal commissioners overseeing the dissolution had every practical incentive to catalog, remove, and convert to royal profit, precisely as they did with the Abbey's lead roofing and other substantial physical assets. Bronze bells requiring skilled casting and representing a genuine, quantifiable material value in their metal content alone were a category of monastic property that dissolution commissioners across England are documented, in surviving royal records, as having systematically inventoried and, in many cases, ordered melted down for their metal value. This practice confirmed by surviving commissioners' accounts from numerous dissolved monastic houses beyond Glastonbury specifically. This is where the straightforward, mainstream explanation for the fate of Glastonbury's bells, plural, since the Abbey almost certainly possessed more than one, holds considerable weight. Most were probably melted down, along with the rest of the Abbey's confiscated metal assets, their bronze converted to royal revenue in the ordinary, well-documented manner that dissolution commissioners handled such property across England generally. This is not, in itself, a mysterious fate, but rather the routine, if regrettable, administrative process of institutional destruction that swept across English monastic life during this period, a process for which we have substantial general documentation, even where specific individual object histories weren't always separately recorded in the kind of detail modern historians might wish for. And yet, as with our other Glastonbury-adjacent history, tradition specifically concerning at least one bell, sometimes described in later local and antiquarian accounts as the Abbey's largest and most prized, holds that this particular object was not simply melted down alongside the ordinary run of confiscated monastic metal, but was instead deliberately concealed by the Abbey's remaining community or by sympathetic local residents in the desperate final period between Abbot Whiting's arrest and the commissioner's systematic stripping of the Abbey's remaining assets. This tradition, it must be said honestly, exists in a considerably more uncertain documentary space than most of the historical claims we've examined across this series. It draws primarily on local Somerset folklore and later antiquarian writing, particularly accounts compiled in the 18th and 19th centuries, well after the events themselves, rather than on any surviving contemporary 16th century document that directly references a specific bell being hidden. This is a meaningfully different evidentiary situation than, for instance, the Owain Glyndŵr Treasury, where at least some elements of the concealment tradition appear in sources closer to the actual events. Why, then, include this tradition at all in an honest exploration of medieval mysteries? Because the general plausibility of the underlying scenario, whatever the specific evidentiary weakness of this particular local tradition, is worth taking seriously on its own terms. We know, from well-documented events at other English monasteries facing dissolution during this same turbulent period, that monastic communities facing the loss of their institution sometimes did act, in the limited time available to them, to conceal or otherwise place beyond the crown's immediate reach whatever portable valuables they could manage, whether out of genuine hope that political circumstances might eventually reverse, or simply out of an understandable desire to deny royal commissioners the full material fruits of an institution's destruction. Surviving records from several other dissolved monasteries do document instances of plate, vestments, and other valuables being concealed, sometimes successfully evading confiscation for years, or even permanently before eventual rediscovery, if rediscovery ever came at all. Given this broader, well-documented pattern of monastic resistance to confiscation elsewhere in England, the specific claim that Glastonbury's community, facing the same pressures and operating within the same general time frame, might have attempted something similar with at least one particularly valued bell, is not implausible in principle, even where the specific supporting evidence for this particular claim remains considerably thinner than we'd ideally want. Where might such concealment, if it occurred as tradition suggests, have taken the bell? Here, the speculation becomes considerably more localized and considerably more folkloric in character. Glastonbury's own immediate landscape offers several features that local tradition has, over the centuries, variously associated with the missing bell. The Abbey's own extensive grounds, including areas that later archaeological work has confirmed, contained substantial subsurface features including wells, drainage systems, and undercroft spaces not fully mapped even by modern archaeological survey, present one obvious category of potential concealment location, consistent with the kind of readily available, easily accessed hiding places a monastic community with intimate, decades-long familiarity with their own grounds might have turned to under pressure. More distinctively, local Somerset tradition has, in various forms across different centuries, associated the missing bell with the nearby wetlands of the Somerset Levels, the low-lying, historically marshy terrain surrounding Glastonbury that has, across the site's much longer history stretching back well before the medieval abbey's founding, repeatedly yielded archaeological finds preserved by the particular waterlogged, low-oxygen conditions that Somerset's peat-rich wetlands provide, conditions that have, at other sites across this same regional landscape, proven remarkably effective at preserving organic and metal objects across many centuries that would have deteriorated far more rapidly in ordinary soil conditions elsewhere. This general pattern of wetland preservation across the Somerset Levels, confirmed by genuine, well-documented archaeological finds from the broader region spanning periods from the prehistoric through the medieval, lends at least a degree of general environmental plausibility to traditions associating concealed Glastonbury valuables with the surrounding wetland landscape. Even though no specific find directly confirming this particular bell's presence in this particular kind of location has, as far as documented archaeological record indicates, ever been made. It's a case, similar in some respects to Harald Hardrada's regalia, where the general environmental and historical plausibility of a scenario exceeds the specific, direct evidence confirming that scenario actually occurred as tradition describes it. More recent interest in the bell's possible fate has been shaped considerably by the broader modern popular fascination with Glastonbury generally, a site that has, since at least the 19th century, attracted a very particular concentration of alternative historical and spiritual interest, extending well beyond conventional academic archaeology and history, connected to the site's Arthurian associations, and its role in various strands of modern spiritual and esoteric tradition. This broader context has, understandably, produced no shortage of considerably more speculative theories regarding the bell's fate, some connecting it to broader claims about hidden treasure, or sacred objects associated with the Abbey's more legendary Arthurian and early Christian traditions, claims that venture well beyond anything supportable by documented historical or archaeological evidence, and that responsible historians studying the site's genuine medieval history generally treat with the same measured skepticism they apply to the broader body of Glastonbury legend accumulated since the 12th century. Setting aside these more elaborate speculative theories, what remains, when we approach this specific question with appropriate historical caution, is a genuinely modest and honest uncertainty. We know Glastonbury Abbey possessed substantial bells prior to its 1539 dissolution. We know that dissolution commissioners across England systematically confiscated and typically melted down monastic bell metal as a matter of well-documented general practice. We know that at least some other English monastic communities, facing comparable circumstances during this same turbulent period, did attempt to conceal valuable property from confiscation, with varying and not always successful results. And we have a persistent, if evidentially thin, and comparatively late documented local tradition holding that Glastonbury's community attempted something similar with at least one particularly valued bell. Whether this tradition preserves a genuine folk memory of an actual 16th century event, however imperfectly transmitted across subsequent centuries of retelling, or whether it represents a later, understandable piece of storytelling attaching itself naturally to a site already so thoroughly saturated with legend and lost treasure tradition of every kind, is a question the surviving evidence simply doesn't allow us to answer with confidence in either direction. Archaeological work at Glastonbury Abbey continues, conducted with considerably more rigor and considerably more skepticism toward the site's more elaborate legendary claims than characterized some of the site's earlier, more credulous 19th and early 20th century investigations. Work focused on carefully separating genuine medieval and earlier archaeological evidence from the thick layers of subsequent myth. Making the site has accumulated across many centuries of pilgrimage, tourism, and spiritual significance. This careful, ongoing work has added considerably to our confirmed understanding of the Abbey's genuine medieval architectural history and its documented dissolution. It has not, to date, produced any confirmed physical evidence specifically resolving the fate of the Abbey's bells, whether concealed as tradition holds, or, as the more straightforward and probably more likely explanation suggests, simply melted down in the ordinary, thoroughly documented manner that swept away so much of English monastic material culture during this brief, brutal period of institutional destruction. Perhaps that straightforward explanation is, in the end, precisely correct, and no bell lies waiting anywhere in Glastonbury's grounds or the surrounding wetlands, its bronze having been converted to royal coin within months of Abbot Whiting's execution. Its specific individual history simply never separately recorded amid the broader, well-documented general destruction visited on the Abbey's material wealth. Or perhaps, in some undocumented final act of quiet resistance, a community that had already lost its abbot to the executioner's rope on the hill above found one small way to keep something of their abbey's memory from the crown's melting pots, concealing it somewhere within the grounds they had tended for generations, or within the wetlands beyond, where Somerset's ancient peat has, across so many other centuries and so many other objects, proven itself remarkably willing to keep a secret for as long as it's asked to.